Hi, and welcome to part 15 or rather 16, of the Major Arcana series that I have been doing. We are almost done. Just a few more, and then we will be Staprunt. Um, okay, so today we are talking about, again, one of the most misunderstood cards about the whole deck. And of course, that statement is kind of cliche at this point. A lot of people preface talking about the devil with "it's the most misunderstood card of the whole deck," but it is true. I think it's the one card in the deck that, especially Crowley's deck, I think that gets the least understood by the average person, or even the average tarot user. I think the average tarot user themselves tends to look at Crowley's devil with a particular way of looking at it, either that isn't necessarily positive or negative, but they tend to look at it with kind of the Jungian, it's the shadow self type of thing. It's one's personal dark side, and so it's not necessarily evil, but it is a source of temptation and needs to be overcome. Well, that is not what Crowley wanted it to mean at all. And I think that's what I'm getting at. He really wanted it to be a symbol, or rather, he really saw it as a symbol of the Messiah. And I know that's a very loaded word. Um, but he wanted it to be connected to the idea of salvation, which, of course, the irony is what I think obfuscates the card tremendously, because, of course, in Christian cosmogony, we know that the devil is the source of damnation and is the cause for the need of salvation in the first place. But Crowley is not looking at it from that perspective. Crowley did not believe in a literal devil that was, the antithesis of God, at all. There, in his mindset, there is no force of evil that sort of counteracts God. There can only be one God, in the macrocosmic sense. I think it's sometimes tough to parse out what he meant, with the multiplicity of gods. But the pretty standard Kabbalistic response is that each of us are made essentially into divine beings, so to speak, because we are endowed with sparks of the spirit. We each bear a subjective keter to ourselves, and because we bear that separate will, that separate consciousness, we are therefore, gods in and of ourselves. Any living thing that can claim a will of its own can be considered a deity, in the sense that it is a living thing that is divine. So, prepare yourself for a long video. I have a lot to say about this card, that it's going to take me a while to kind of refresh and pull up. But it is a very important card because it does form one of the major foundations of what Crowley's system was about, and why Crowley's system is actually, in my opinion, is actually very similar to Christianity, for the modern era. And I think people overlook that a lot because of his particular sexual habits and his drug habits, neither of which I want to give the space of talking about because I don't believe they have much bearing on what he taught in general. Obviously, there are many aspects of his life that I don't agree with, but there are some general ideas that he had about religion and the formula of attainment and the great work that I do agree with. And I think those are more endearing for me than the other stuff. Anywho, so why this card then can represent the Messiah? This is quite the conundrum. But it is. Oh, I haven't showed you the card. In case you don't know what it looks like, it is here. It looks scarier than it's meant to be. The chaos in the background is supposed to be reminiscent of the planet Mars, apparently, because Mars is, what is it? Mars rules Capricorn, and Saturn is exalted in him, and of course the card is Capricorn. Now, Capricorn is opposite Cancer on the wheel, the zodiac wheel, and it is the point in the solstice, or excuse me, in the calendar, at which point the sun starts making its return journey back into fullness of, a day, basically. Obviously, during the fall and the winter, the sun seems to die, and obviously the days become shorter, depending on your time zone, of course, but in general, the days become shorter in the winter during the months of Capricorn. But at the same time, with Capricorn comes a change where the days slowly start to get a little bit longer. And the sun is in some ways reborn. Now, the other thing is that, of course, the birthday of Christ, or Mithras, was December 25th, or is December 25th, rather, which is a day that is in Capricorn's span of time. So Jesus was a Capricorn, and oftentimes his behavior in the Gospels reflects that. The devil is literally a card that represents, to me, the Word made flesh, because it is a card that is supposed to represent incarnation of pure spiritual force. It is the clothing in form of force, okay? Because it is the path, it is the 26th path that goes from Tiphareth to Hod. So now we have talked about, or we will have talked about, all three paths that emanate from Tiphareth. Now remember that Tiphareth is the solar center of the Tree of Life and is the center of Christ consciousness, or is essentially the center of, or the Sephirah associated with sacrificial gods and redemption gods, but also gods associated with divine intoxication and prophecy. So, it is the opposite of the Death card, because the Death card, of course, moves from Tiphareth to Netzach, which is on the right-hand pillar, but this card leads to Hod, which is Mercury, as opposed to Netzach being Venus. This leads to Mercury on the left-hand pillar, and Mercury is one of the first Sephirah that we have, where we have a definite sense of clothing in form, something in form. As you know, I've been reading Dion Fortune's Mystical Kabbalah, and she says it pretty explicitly, that Hod is about form, because it is about abstract idea. And as soon as you can create a mental picture of something with words, or anything like that, it has a form. You can contemplate something like that. I can conjure the image of the devil card in my head. Therefore, it is easy to recognize that it is something that has form in the physical world. I don't know. This is just a really crappy way of explaining that. But Hod is associated with that. Hod is also, being Mercury, is also associated with the Logos, with the Word, with that masculine potency that is the archetypal constructor and architect of the universe, or the subjective universe of the individual person. Now, this is when I like to remind people that Christ is the Logos, that Christ was most likely not a carpenter because he was a literal carpenter, but because Christ is the literal architect of the universe. And so what other job would they give Jesus, being an allegorical figure? Carpentry! Ta-da! Okay, so they had kind of a sense of humor about the whole thing, I think. And I think we sort of have to look back on this stuff with a sense of humor and really look at it from a metaphorical lens and not a literal lens. I've talked about that before. Especially because we are dealing with archetypes and symbols, and there is very little we can take literally about any of this. So we have essentially the essence of Tiphareth being given a form. But remember that it's also taking on the influence of the masculine from the right-hand pillar. Because oddly enough, at Tiphareth we get sort of a switch around, excuse me, where the influence of the right-hand pillar kind of shifts through Tiphareth, the great equalizer, and starts exerting more of an influence on the left-hand pillar. And vice versa, the left-hand pillar, when it goes through Tiphareth, kind of switches onto the right-hand pillar. So Netzach is a Sephirah that is kind of a hybrid between right and left, but deriving great influence from the left-hand pillar, actually. And Hod is the same thing, vice versa. So Hod is the original word as understood by from a logical perspective. It is also the Sephirah of ceremonial magic, which is interesting, because so of course that is very relevant for this card as well. This card has a tendency to represent magical ability, particularly, and the individual's ability. This card is very similar to the Magus. It is the ability of the individual to make manifest, literally manifest, essentially that which they desire, and they go about it through ceremonial magic. That is one way of looking at this card. But I think if we look at the devil for Crowley represented the initiated person. He says that Cain in the Bible, that Cain and Abel, I'm sorry, I'm still sick, and I know some of you can't stand my sniffling and all that, but I'm doing my best here for you. What was I going to say? So Cain and Abel, he says that Abel is actually the first person to commit a murder, because Abel is sacrificing animals. Abel is sacrificing living things. And so it really is kind of silly to call Cain the first murderer, because Abel is the first murderer of a living thing. He's the first killer of something living. And Cain, of course, well, from the Gnostic perspective, Cain, of course, sensing God's falsity, basically, as the God of law and order, defies God and says, no, that is not how I wish to worship God. That is not what is correct or moral. And so God, so of course he kills his brother, and Crowley says that by killing his brother he is able to get God's attention. And God, of course, exiles him and marks him with what Crowley calls the sign of initiation. He gives him horns. So the horned one, the idea of the horned one for Crowley has to do with initiation. And what is initiation? Initiation, at its most basic level, takes place in Tiphareth and is understanding of the divine self. It is understanding of the subjective reality, why it works the way it does, and it is becoming cognizant of one's personal divine truth. And so, this is why the individual who is initiated is seen as a devil. The idea that Crowley also says is that anything that is considered bad by general people is going to be labeled a devil. Anything and everything can be a devil. If my computer stops working, I can call it an SOB and a devil, and, etc. I can call it a lot of derogatory things, and often I do. But it doesn't mean that the computer obviously is evil, possessed, or meant to be demonic or anything like that. I can say that I mean, it's so easy to talk about this. I mean, in our current day and age, the demonization of general minorities. I mean, if you think about the demonization of Muslims in America, how we love to think that all Muslims everywhere, especially in conservative parts of the country, people tend to think that all Muslims are evil. All Muslims believe in, murder being good, all these outlandish things that not all Muslims necessarily believe, and which by creating a hyperbolic understanding of the situation results in not understanding the situation at all, obviously. So, I mean, anything that you don't like, anything that you see as a threat to yourself, can be seen as a devil, as evil. And so the line between good and evil is incredibly fine and incredibly subjective. Incredibly subjective. I mean, Crowley's whole point about God and disobeying God on Cain's part is that there is no universal sense of morality. Nature itself does not say things like, killing is wrong. If anything, nature says killing is absolutely A-okay. I mean, watch Animal Planet. It is not cut and dry, and mankind really wants to make it cut and dry, and it doesn't work that way. This is the thing, that if you really want to understand morality, you can't go into morality just saying that you believe in it because some other being has told you to believe in it. It has to be genuine. Morality has to be learned, and morality must be appreciated as for why it is in place. Any tenet of morality must be put through the test of fire by every individual. Otherwise, you create a pretty insipid group of people who think they're doing the right thing and get really high and mighty because they're doing the right thing, even though they really have no proof as to why what they're doing is the right thing. They just, get really offended when people don't do what they're doing, and it becomes a source of groupthink and really all sorts of awful things. And that's not necessarily good. How productive is that really? How much do we really learn from behaving like that? Not very much. And so that's the other big point of the devil, is that the devil is a devil because he does not necessarily take for granted human morality. God's morality as the disseminator of law. Tetragrammaton is seen as the giver of law, or Jehovah, Yahweh, all those pronunciations of that word. That is what Cain defies. And the idea is that by killing the ignorance of Abel, by slaying that, Cain attains a level of understanding and gnosis that is very crucial to the process of individuation. So that is another aspect of it. But if I were to, I want to also get at why this card is so ironically Christian. This card very much explains Jesus' personality. Jesus does not defend religion. I'm sure some of you have seen that video with the guy rapping or, doing his little poetry thing about why he loves Jesus and hates religion. It's not my favorite thing that I've ever seen on YouTube, but the guy makes a pretty valid point in saying that Jesus did not appreciate people who did outward external religion. Essentially, the stuff that the Hierophant represents in the tarot. Jesus was much, much more about internal conversion and things that existed on a plane of reality that had very little to do with the here and now. And the way Christ deals with people, I mean, Christ does everything that anyone would have considered in that period wrong, morally wrong. The average Jewish person in the time of Jesus would have looked at Jesus, as we know from reading the Gospels, would have looked at Jesus and seen him as being absolutely crazy, out of his mind, and evil. They would have seen him as evil, and they would have seen him as a complete amoralist. He did not, as much as he talks about, needing to follow the law of the prophets and Moses, he approaches that law of Moses and the prophets from a much more enlightened perspective. And the Gospels also talk about this, how Christ is one who speaks about these things with authority, we are told, because he gets what they're talking about. He gets the point of the law and focuses on the reason behind the law and not necessarily the law itself. It's almost about minimalizing and deconstructing that law so that it, again, becomes about discovering the kernel of moral truth behind it, or experiential moral truth, that has been developed just through human experience, and not because God has said, thou shalt not do blank, and etc. But Jesus, Jesus dealt with publicans and prostitutes and lepers and tax collectors. Clearly, this was a big no-no. Jesus forgives people their sins without any asking of permission from anyone else, and this pisses a lot of people off. I mean, Jesus goes through his entire life utterly reviled, except by his followers. And I think people love to forget that, because even the people that Jesus heals are not necessarily on his side. And I think that is something also that gets greatly overlooked in the Bible. I think that is one of the major points, is that even though Christ is followed by this multitude endlessly, they're constantly following him and banging down the door practically to get to Jesus. But there's this sense that the mob is fickle, that mob is the same, that mob of believers is the same mob at the Passion. And I think, again, it's the allegorical mob of mass groups of people. And the way Christ is born utterly rejected. He comes into the world despised and rejected, and dies despised and rejected, and still has the gall to say that he is dying for those people who have scorned him and hated him, and he does it out of love anyway. And that is what is profound about Christianity, and has always been profound about Christianity, because otherwise Christianity has nothing that makes it unique. Its sacraments are not unique, its general story is not unique, but the idea that God will actually give itself up out of love for its own creations that hate it, that don't want to do what it tells them to do, that is profound. And that is what's moving about Christianity, and is relevant for the general Western spiritual experience. And I would argue the human spiritual experience in general, on different levels of interpretation. So, that is why the devil can represent the Messiah. I mean, in addition to the fact that, the serpent in Eden gives Adam and Eve knowledge of their, he basically gives them consciousness. Before that, they're lost in, a state of ignorant adoration. And from the Gnostic perspective, it's certainly ignorant adoration. It's not necessarily positive adoration. I mean, there's a difference, I think, where we're taught in this view of Christianity that, the adoration of Adam and Eve is very different from the adoration of, say, the Virgin Mary. That they are very different. So that's another layer as well. And the Gnostics believed that Christ was the twin, in some ways, of Satan. And some even believed that Satan was Christ, that the serpent in the Garden of Eden was a form of Christ, as the bestower of enlightenment and of knowledge and truth. He is the light, the truth, and the way. And that's also what's interesting about the devil, too. The devil, as an initiated person, understands their own truth in their own way. And the idea is that that person cannot go any other way. There is no possible legroom. A person is who they are. And in understanding that, one can become a thorn in the side of the masses who want society to be very cut and dry. And I'll tell you, from meditating on all these things for many months, years at this point, it occurred to me that by doing that, we are all equally guilty of the passion. We are all equally guilty of it, almost no matter what level of attainment we are at. Because we are born rejecting him. And that is original sin. That we are born rejecting God, who is the essence behind our lives. It is the holy guardian angel, our higher self. That part of us that only wants what is best for each of us. And yet we still cannot conform to its will. And every time we do that, we give another whiplash, or we spit on his face, or anything like that. And I do think, the image of Christ being whipped at the pillar is very evocative for me of this card, and of some others as well, but how man very much wants to tell God what to do. I think about how perhaps the most humiliating part of the Passion is the whipping and the crown of thorns. And I mean, how absolutely humiliating those are. In some ways more so than the actual crucifixion next to slaves. And the act of whipping repeatedly, and I know this is not something that some of you are probably interested in. I mean, I know not everyone who watches my videos, I'm sure, are coming at this from a Christian perspective, but from a standpoint of mythology and allegory, it's incredibly relevant. It's so relevant. Every time we want to make God out to what we want it to be, we're whipping Christ. And I know that sounds harsh, or perhaps even silly, but I that's what I've been taught in a way, through my own process of initiation, if you will. I mean, as I do this and meditate on these things, these are the things that I think about. And obviously they're not happy things by any chance, but they're very relevant. So this is all just stuff to think about. I mean, there is so much about this card that I have not talked about, because I don't think I need to tell you things you can find in a book about some of these cards. And that is sort of the nitty-gritty that I confront every time I think about this card. And how, in conjunction with the Death card, we really get the image of Christ from a lower level. If the devil is a representation of Set, then Death is certainly a representation of Osiris, and the two were brothers and supposedly enemies. One was supposedly positive, the other supposedly negative, but yet they both emanate from Tiphareth. They are both two sides of the same coin, and with art running between the two of them, descending on the middle pillar, we can sort of see that the androgyne does not necessarily just represent masculine and feminine archetypes of the personality, but also represents death and the devil. That the two are really merged, and that is the image of the Messiah, of the Holy Guardian Angel. And the perhaps the confirming or vindicating thing here is that neither of those cards are particularly loved by tarot people, death and the devil, or the average person. The average person gets death or the devil in their spread and they freak out. But the reality is, if we are using the Kabbalistic system, anyone's Kabbalistic system, those two cards are situated in that place. I say anyone kind of loosely, but I mean anyone who is using the letter associations that most people use, I mean, with excluding the star and the emperor because of Crowley's switching around. But yeah, I'm gonna stop there. I'm gonna shut up about this finally. But please, if you have any questions, comments, please leave them. Don't forget to like the video. And I hope you found this interesting. I know it was a little preachy, but sorry. That's what I'm here for, I think. So, okay, I will see you next time for number 16, an equally bleak card, but or bleak, the Tower. Okay, so thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.